Want you to imagine with me for a few minutes here a press conference. There's the big curtain behind the wall with some kind of emblem. There's a podium. The reporters are all gathered, some with their new digital recording devices. Some of the old school ones still have a notebook and a pen ready to take notes. The photographers are clickety-clicking. And somebody walks out and gives their speech that touches on economic stuff. And at some point they say, "Let me make this clear. If you're not willing to work, you're not going to eat. We're not going to have a bunch of freeloaders who do nothing and don't contribute but live off the taxes that the rest of us pay after doing all of our hard work that we do." Have you heard that speech before? All right, now I want you to imagine who it is that is about. Who's the freeloader? What does that person look like? What is the stereotype that we have? Now, don't say anything out loud. Just hold that in your head. Who is it that person is talking about when they give that speech? Park that for a minute. Today, we heard from 2 Thessalonians. This is Paul writing to the Thessalonians, and he said that exact same thing. Paul says, if you are unwilling to work, you shouldn't get to eat. And he cautions them on hanging around with people that are idle. And I think he calls them busybodies. And so we get this word from Paul. Now, this is also the guy who tells us that we are saved by grace through faith, not by works. And here, the guy who said that same thing is saying, but if you don't work, you don't get to eat, right? And so he sounds quite American, really, when he says this little stretch of 2 Thessalonians. But we hear that because we are American, and this is the kind of stuff we talk about. Well, we have to remember that he's not. He was writing to people a very long time ago in a place called Thessalonica, where he had been. And so it's helpful perhaps for us to go imagine what it was probably like when Paul first got there to maybe get at what it is he's trying to say. So when Paul arrived, there wasn't like congregations everywhere that he could just pop in and go, oh, maybe I'll go to church this week. Which one should I go to? There wasn't one. He was the one who started to gather people and tell them about Jesus because he had had this transformative experience in his own faith. And so he shows up as a tent maker. It's a port city. It's the capital city of Macedonia. There's probably like 100 and some thousand people that live there. There's a busy marketplace. And so he goes down to that crowded marketplace and he finds maybe a storefront shop and says, this is where I'm going to start. And he has to pay for that, right? So he uses his business to feed himself and to make his presence possible. And then as he's fixing people's tents or selling tents, I don't know how a tent maker worked back then, probably he says to people, what's your story? And he listens. And he probably gets to hear a fair bit of their suffering and their struggles. And then he probably at one point goes, yeah, I've been there. But let me tell you about Jesus. And pretty soon, he starts to have some people that find his story compelling. And the story of the gospel really is the compelling bit. And as he tells them that, they start to say, can we talk more about this? And he's like, well, I got tent work here, so we'll have to do that later, like tonight. And when you hear in the little stretch that we heard, Paul says, when we were among you, we worked night and day. So he had to work all day to pay the bills, and then at night he would gather these church people, or becoming church people, and pretty soon they start to have a congregation. But that congregation is learning to live differently than the empire around them. They gather for common meals. They begin, if you listen to the book of Acts, they shared lots of things in common that maybe their neighbors did not do. Because they are learning about this God that Paul is talking about, they stop worshiping the other gods, one of whom is the emperor, because the emperor was thought to be divine. And what happens when you stop worshiping the emperor when everybody else in your neighborhood does? You're now not religious. You're also a heretic and unpatriotic because the emperor is the state and the state is the emperor. And you stop going to some of the parties because they're sacrificing animals and doing different things that don't really fit your new journey that has been transformative for your life. And so now you're antisocial. So Paul gets this whole little church together that's this little group of people in this great big city, and they are now starting to act and live differently than their neighbors. And then what does Paul say? See you later, I got to go to a different city and start over. So as he's gone, some stuff starts to happen. They get persecuted. This is a time when being a church person wasn't a safe thing to be all the time. Now, I will tell you that, and most of you know this, being church is hard. Starting a church is hard. Keeping a church going is hard. Living together as church people is hard, because sometimes we say things we shouldn't and do things we shouldn't and hurt each other's feelings and don't ask for forgiveness. Like, being the church is hard. And that's when everything around you was going well. They were getting persecuted. So then there were people who came among them and said, this must be the end times, like we heard from the gospel today, right? You'll get persecuted. Some of you are going to get killed. You're going to get thrown in jail. And when you start to get persecuted, at some point, it's easy to say, you know what? Worshiping that other God wasn't so bad. I didn't get persecuted when I did that. Maybe I can go back to that other way. But then you have others who start to say, well, maybe Paul's version of the gospel wasn't exactly right. I bet we can do a little bit of both, like still go to those parties and do those things, but also follow Jesus. And so when he writes the letter back, he's like, listen, you got to watch out for this stuff. And he says to them, beware of believers who are idle. So right away, he's narrowed what we hear him say about, like, don't eat if you don't work. He's not talking about the whole community around them. He's talking about the church. He's saying, beware of those who are idle. So those who are showing up, but not really putting in any effort. And that's when he says, if you're not willing to work, maybe you shouldn't eat. And then he comes around to the end and says, look, do not weary of doing good. So I think Paul's actually addressing a question for them, which is, how do we be this little group of people that acts and behaves different when the whole community around us is living a different story, and on top of that are persecuting us? And at the same time, we came to this place because it was compelling to us, and we found it life-giving. This story of death and resurrection of Jesus has changed my life, and now I'm here. How do we do that? And they're starting to have trouble with it because some are showing up and not pitching in, and others are teaching things that maybe weren't what they heard. Now, you got that picture in your head of when the guy gives the speech about who's not pitching in, right? Did any of you picture yourself? So, in Paul's community that he's writing to in Thessalonica, there was probably some people who thought the end times were coming. So if the end times are coming, like if you knew, if I could tell you today, Friday is it. Jesus is coming back. Everything after that is going to be heavenly kingdom or whatever comes next. What do you do this week? Don't pay your bills. Anybody cutting the grass? Right? Like Martin Luther supposedly said if he knew the world was ending, he'd plant a tree. But by and large, right, you just go, well, if the end's coming, what's the point? So probably they have people who are like, look, the end's coming. What's the point? They probably also had some people who thought, well, no, I'm the spiritual one, so I'm just going to pray. And you all should feed me because I'm praying. Actually, me saying that out loud when you pay me to be the pastor here sounds a little like I should probably go get a job. Which is what Paul says. He's like, look, when I came among you, I had every right to be supported by you, but I didn't take advantage of that. I worked so that I could be among you. And so he's saying you need to follow that example because we're trying to be a different group of people. So you probably have some who are just like, look, the end times are coming. Then you have some who think they're just more spiritual than everybody else, so they shouldn't have to work. You probably also had some who never worked because they were wealthy. So other people worked for them, and their money worked for them. And they're used to being served, so they just show up, and somebody says, what did you bring to the potluck? And they're like, well, I don't cook. I got people that do that, right? And then were there some people who were lazy? Maybe. But my guess is it was this mix of all of this that showed up to that church, right? Now, you all know the 20-80 rule? 20% of the people in most places do 80% of the work. I think that's what Paul's finding out, right? And so Paul is not talking to the whole community. He's talking to the church who's trying to figure out how to be the church when you're persecuted, when you're considered unpatriotic, when you're considered heretical, and all the rest of that. And I think what he's saying is everybody is needed. Now, he says it cranky. If you don't work, if you're not willing to, you shouldn't get paid. Now, this is probably Paul's first letter. By the time he gets to writing the Corinthians, I think he's grown a little bit. Because what he tells the Corinthians is, hey, you all, each and every one of you have gifts. Some of you have gifts for teaching, some of you for preaching, some of you for like all the different gifts. And then he says, and all of them are necessary. This is where he talks about the church being the body of Christ, and he says the whole body can't just be ears, the whole body can't just be eyes, and he talks about the weaker member of the body as being indispensable. So by the time he writes the Corinthians, I think his message has become, if we're going to do this, it's going to take all of us showing up and sharing our gifts. But when he writes the Thessalonians, he hasn't gotten that far yet, so he just says, look, if you're going to show up, you got to work or you probably shouldn't get to eat. But what I really think he's trying to do is encourage them to be this different kind of community. And you know this because in the other places where he talks about caring for your neighbor, and he talks about grace as this free gift, I don't think he's saying here grace isn't free. I think he's saying if we're going to be church together, we got to be church together. And it's going to take all of us pulling in the same direction. But the purpose being to share this gift of grace that he has experienced and that they have experienced by learning about Jesus through their connections together as church. Now, we're quite a few years on, and the church collectively is quite a bit bigger than the church at Thessalonica. But this congregation, are we huge? No. We're a little space. Are we heretical? I get called a heretic, which means you're all heretics as well. And mostly that's by other church people, which is the same thing that happened in Thessalonica, right? They wouldn't worship the emperor, so they said, well, you don't understand God then, so you're unreligious and heretical. Let me ask you this way. Is the world filled with grace and acceptance and inclusion? No. Are we an island of working at being better at that in a world that is not that? Right? So that makes us not unlike those people in Thessalonica. We might be called heretical because we think that God's love is actually for everyone, that we invite everyone to the table, that we have a statement on our website that talks about God's love for all people. That's not how everybody thinks about God, right? So we got that little bit. And then when you think about what Paul is trying to get them to do is live differently, to be community together. Is our world full of healthy, strong communities of people that work and live together? Not so much, right? And so in our country, which has so much division and everything else, what we're trying to accomplish here matters deeply. And so Paul's word that comes to us is very much the same word. Maybe not, look, you don't get to participate at the table if you're not putting the effort in. I would never say that. But all of your gifts are necessary. All of our gifts are necessary for us to be the church that God has planted us here to be. And those gifts come in all kinds of ways in the same way Paul talks about them. Some of it's the gifts and talents we have. Some of you, us, can't do math. But we have a finance team that does it really, really well. Some of us are artistic. Some of us are not. Some of us are good at just showing up and doing whatever needs to get done. Some people can cook. Some can clean. Like all of those things are necessary for us to be community. Do you think the 20-80 rule gets lived out here? It does. It's probably not even 20, really, right? So when we hear this message from Paul, it's really a message to say, like, when we gather for fellowship, that means we've got to show up and be together to do that. As we enter into a season where we talk about church finances, it takes all of our gifts to make this place work. And again, what we do here matters deeply. I wish I could take you everywhere I go as a pastor to hear and interact with all the stories that I get to hear and interact with. I tell you this stuff all the time, like, lives get changed because we're here. But those aren't my stories to share. And if I could share those stories with you, I would, but they're not mine. And I'm hoping that some of those stories do get shared because they're deep and they're meaningful. And they happen because we're here. And because we're putting in the work that Paul invites us to put in. Today, Rather than hear it as some kind of works thing that we have to do to be fed, I think we should hear it as an encouragement to really double our efforts and redouble them at being church together. Are we going to mess that up all the time? Are we going to get it perfect? Never. But are we going to carry grace out into the world together? Yep. Earlier, I asked you to think about that speech and who you envision there. Now I want to flip that around and say, what about this place has been compelling to you? What about your encounter with Jesus has been transformative for you? Those are the important stories that we share with the world. That's what fuels what we do in this place and have done for 40 years almost and will continue to do. Not because we have to earn God's grace somehow, but because we already have that gift. And together, all of us bringing our gifts, we get to share that gift with the world and see that transformation happen again and again. Amen.